And then finally, again, with a word of thanks to everyone here today. Thanks to the board members and volunteers who have made this possible. I am uh, pleased to announce our speaker for today, Dan Hobbs. He is a writer and a researcher. He writes historical fiction over different topics and different eras, and he is going to share with us some of his fiction grounded in historical research about Revolutionary Howard County and a lot of his other stories and research along the way. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dan E. Haas.
I'm gonna shock you all right off of the bat here and say, you know that I don't always dress this way. That's why I put that picture up there just so. And also, it occurred to me that in this politically correct environment that we live, the term thugs might be a little offensive. So if you're one of the thugs from Elkridge, that's a euphemism in this time for me to use as patriot because the thugs were actually some ardent sons of liberty. So I'll explain that a little bit more as we go along, exactly what that was. No one taught me how to use this, so let's see if this works. It does. Wonderful. Okay, so the very first thing I've got to say is this is a foot stomper. I am not an historian. I am not trained in the deep study of history. So, what I am actually is an Irish storyteller, and I was blessed to stumble across an amazing story that you may or may not know about the Peggy Stewart that brought 2,000 pounds of that noxious weed tea into the Annapolis harbor on the 15th of October, 1774. So that's a story that first you think, oh, who cares, tea, right? But you got to put it in the right time frame and what was going on. Well, I actually am as a career Air Force officer. I spent 23 years in uniform. I spent another 20 years as a consultant to the Department of Defense, and believe it or not, Air Force futures. My job from the time I was a young captain all the way to the time I retired, the second retirement, was looking way out into the future for the United States Air Force and helping the Air Force solve problems on what weapon systems we need, mostly aircraft. I was an aircraft kind of guy. So I spent a lot of time, literally at least 30, 35 years in technical writing where my role was to put a team together. The Air Force would hand us a very challenging issue about something they thought they might need in the future. And we would do a lot of analysis, assemble a story and write it out and hand it to the government so they could throw it in the garbage. No, I'm kidding. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. But the point being is the very skills that were required to do that job, minus one aspect, and that was creative writing, is what I did for 30 years. So there are a lot of reports, if you want to call it that. And one day I was sitting, about 2015, I was sitting at my desk reading one of the reports our team had put together. I thought, oh my gosh, this stuff is so boring, I can't hardly stand to read it myself. So I pulled a couple of pages out and I started throwing in adjectives and adverbs, adding taste and feel and that kind of thing. And I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. And of course, I had to take that all out before we surrendered to the government. That it set me off on a path of writing. I started writing short stories, mostly about creatures and about flying. People seem to enjoy those. And I was going to write another short story. So I started doing some homework about one of my ancestors who lived near Elkridge. And he was indeed one of the thugs from Elkridge. And I'll go into more detail about that in just a bit. But that short story ended up being about 500 pages, and it's sitting over here called Cleave America Patriot Flames 1774. And I know I could just look at you and you're thinking, why Cleave America? There's actually going to be three, or we're close to finishing the third Cleave America novel. The word cleave is the only word in English language that is spelled the same and pronounced the same and has an exact opposite meaning. Think cleave like a cleaver to divide, or cleave as in to cling. Maybe you know this Bible verse, a man should leave his mother and father and cleave unto his wife. So we're looking at a time period in American history where we'll be torn apart as a society, but we have to cleave together, maybe looking a little higher than the mud and muck that surrounds us, day in and day out to move forward as a society. Does that sound familiar? Yes. So anyway, that actually was sitting with one of my wonderful lead engineers who said to me, she, 20 something year old, said, there's never been a more divisive time in America. And I said, you're right. I think there has been. Look, the similar comes to my mind right off the bat. But here is a time period too. If you think that the whole of all the people in America were united against the British, well, you're dead wrong. And one of those guys that had a reputation as a Tory was a guy named Stewart, Anthony Stewart. And he was a merchant, a wealthy merchant, had a beautiful home downtown Annapolis, still there, beautiful home. But then there a time or two. Actually had a bit of a celebration in there last year, last fall, when it was the 250th anniversary of the event. Anthony Stewart was regarded as a merchant. He was friends with some of the movers and shakers, like I'm sorry, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, Chase, Paco, signers of the Declaration of Independence. They were friends. But yes, he was on the other side of the political spectrum. And what was going on in Annapolis during those days? We'll talk about that here, I think. At least we're going forward. Here we go. Got to push the button. All right. Okay, so be careful while you careful let you push on the microphone, I guess. I'll give you the bottom line up front. If you don't know this, that ship burned. All right. So, but there's a twisted, amazing story behind the fact that that ship burned. So you got to picture the circumstances of that era. I mentioned this morning, the population in 1774 of Annapolis, just Annapolis, was around 1,500. I looked up this morning what's the typical size of a cruise ship? It's 3,000. So the population of Annapolis was half the size of they would all fit on a cruise ship and actually had two rooms to each one of it. So it was small, but also Annapolis was a major transportation hub. There was no Baltimore. There was a little village at that time, but Baltimore really wasn't mover and shaker like it is now. It was Annapolis. In fact, if you remember, what was the first capital of the United States of America? Annapolis. That's right. So this was the moving and shaking place. And also, it's pretty important to understand how many people have heard about the Boston Tea Party? You probably, every one of you were taught that in school. How many of you know that there was actually 10 tea parties? Very few. I was said to someone this morning, I can walk the streets of Annapolis, which I have many times, even though I don't live here. I walk there mentally. I walk there physically. I walk the streets. The last time after I finished the manuscript for Patriot Flames, I walked from Anthony Stewart's house down the street to the harbor, and there sat a two-mast tall ship, and I thought I was seeing a ghost. And I walked up to that ship, and there was no, it was about 6:30 in the morning. There was most all around. I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to step on that thing. And there was a little scratcher behind the main mast, and this young midshipman, I believe, stepped out. He said, "Can I help you, sir?" He said, "I just have one quick question. Tell me this is not a brig or a brigantine." And he said, "Oh, gosh, no, sir, this is a schooner. Brigs are much bigger." I was like, that was a big ship, but it wasn't. I was thinking that you'll see why here in a bit. I was thinking it was too small for what I had pictured in my mind. So I walked the streets of Annapolis. I know that 99 out of 100 people, and I asked quite a few people when I said, "What do you think about the Annapolis Tea Party?" I get, "It's Boston." I said, "No, this one here in Annapolis makes the Boston Tea Party look like a Boy Scout operation. This is a dramatic event, and it was the last. And now we're only about 6 to 8 months away from Concord in Lexington. So the heat was on. Yet still, in Annapolis itself, you got a population maybe 50-50 British Royalists versus Sons of Liberty, and those Sons of Liberty were driving an agenda. They wanted to raise up something that would catch the people on fire to move forward. What else was going on in October of 1774? You know, First Continental Congress was meeting. So there is a lot of political angst, a lot of cleave in American society during that time. And I love this. She was young and she was beautiful. The chief investigator and the Peggy Stewart, my first true historical contact in here, told me the ship was rotting and old. Ah, it was not true. That ship was a little over 3 years old. It was named Peggy Stewart because that was the name of Anthony Stewart's daughter. He didn't buy it, he built it. And I found proof, not here, fortunately, unfortunately, buried, but there was proof that that ship was new and it was expensive. It was, Anthony valued it at about 1,500 pounds. How much is that? Well, in today's dollars, about $2 million. It was a $2 million ship. So now that's will say, I say, she died an untimely death to pacify the indignation of the citizens. And you're thinking, what? Why would they burn a $2 million ship of a merchant here that people respected? That was the Peggy Stewart. By the way, that picture there is not of the Peggy Stewart. None of them exist, or no pictures or drawings of the Peggy Stewart exist. But I had a friend of mine who works in the Mariners Museum in Virginia. He supplied me with actual pictures of merchant brigantines. How do you know the difference? You see any cannon sticking out of the side of that? The pirates, by the way, love brigs and brigantines, but this was a merchant ship. It wasn't armed to defend itself. It was just to carry uh, goods across to the ocean and bring them back. Maggie Stewart had tried one time to go out into the big Atlantic, had a little bit of trouble, came back, actually lost some cargo in the process of doing that. And her captain was, believe it or not, Richard Jackson. And what do you think they called Richard Jackson, all the crew? Captain Jack, of course, it had to be Captain Jack. So Captain Jack was the skipper. How many crew members on a brigantine? Any guesses? Took 6 or 7 to get that ship back and forth across the Atlantic. It's amazing, isn't it? A ship that big. Okay. So this is the Peggy Stewart. We're gonna center quite a bit on her, but before we do that, let's get rid of a few myths here. That it was actually a painting of Anthony Stewart. His wife, Jean, beautiful woman. I got a painting of her as well. That's Anthony Stewart. So if you go, I mean, unless it's changed, or maybe my novel has changed Google, or maybe AI is interceded. But I agree that the last time, Google, I said, here on the Peggy Stewart, and this is the Google response. It said Anthony Stewart owned who was a British loyalist. Okay, that's true, but he didn't own it by himself. He actually was him and his father-in-law, Jean's father. They called Mr. Dick, but everybody in town, all 1,500 people, knew Mr. Dick as the good old Tory. So he was definitely a British, oriented British sympathizer, as was Anthony, but still they were wealthy merchants. So that part is exactly true. They actually owned it as joint partners, and they had other people that are interested in the Peggy Stewart and had interest in, I should say, the Peggy Stewart. So they didn't own it singly. Okay, and it says that Anthony Stewart was deeply in debt because of previous money making. Well, honestly, if you look at his resources and what he had at the time, and he had the ability to get that ship to London and back, he had some other financial issues. That was true. He did invest at ironworks, which wasn't working out too well at the time. But to call him deeply in debt was probably a stretch of the truth. He had a lot of assets that he was still holding. His exact worth, I don't know. Later on, he survived all this incident. Of course, later on, he came back and tried to sue the United States government for the loss of his ship, unsuccessfully, of course. And one of the historians in town here believes that he is buried in an unmarked grave at All Hallows Episcopal Church, the 1692 church on the other side of the South River. There's quite a bit of evidence that that's true, that that's where and that he died in around 1790. The rest of his family moved to Halifax after this little incident that he was involved in. And that second, the final bottom sentence there says, this bag spraying, well, I took a gamble of bringing tea to Annapolis. That is absolutely, in my opinion, absolutely not true. In fact, there's quite a bit of evidence that he told Captain Jack, no way bring non-importation items back from England. This is what I want you to do. I want you to take your ship over there, and if you can get top dollar for her, sell her and find a way to come back, you and the crew. If you can't get top dollar, once again, do not put non-importation items. I don't want to upset my friends here, uh, William Baker, uh, Chase, and those guys. I don't want to upset them. So let's just leave luxury goods and whatever else you think you can load on there to make a good killing. I have need for indentured servants. The Thailand has need for indentured servants. All right. That's the background. Are we doing all right? Okay, cool. All right. So I'm telling you, it took me about 2 years to put the whole story together. There was a lot of confusion over the Peggy store and this down and everywhere. And but there is awful lot of evidence out there for the story that I tell. So, okay, yeah, I throw in a few fictional characters, like the first mate on the Peggy store, and a few others. I like that, a little romance, a little people you love to love and people you love to hate. But one of the ones that I think that you would really appreciate is in St. John's, no, St. Anne's. That's a different story. One though, in the morning again, different time. I actually still in the middle of the street on West Street, and I looked through the gate of Annapolis. You all remember that's that, right? Probably not. I looked through the gate of Annapolis, and I'm looking in the front door of St. Anne's, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is exactly the way I wrote it. But there was a guy in there, the Cecily of St. Anne's. His name was Joe Murg. Joe Murg. You know that? Is that? And he was this spiky little creepy guy, I guess, that would go around and everybody he would go, I will have you one day. That was his plan. He liked to scare people like that. Anyway, that's how internet I was with the streets of Annapolis, trying to put my mind back in the 1770s. So I rocked those streets. I've been at the Peggy Stewart house. I've been, which is a landmark, of course, medieval. If you know where the wall of the academy with the chapel is on the other side, it's Hanover Street. Right on the other side of there is the Peggy Stewart house. It's practical old. It's a beautiful house. Had a reception there last year on the 18th of October. It was wonderful. The guy that owns it is a very good, close guy, great guy. And also all the way up the Orr Indian Trail, which I think you all call Route 32 down, that ends up around West Friendship. Well, I may go farther north. I don't know. That's where it stops in my mind. And there are cemeteries up there where some of my ancestors are buried. See that gravestone there has the bottom, it has Hobbs on it. There's a lot of powerful history there. And there's a buddy, I think it's on the next slide here, I hope. They're called Hobbs regulation. I was going to say until I realized that this morning's talk was not in the library, it was here. That was a surprise to me, by the way. Anyway, I went out there, but I was going to say that it was in that library where the Howard County Historical Society housed their some of their items, their documentation, etc., in their office. It was in there that I was struck by the epiphany because one of the workers there said, "Oh, you know about Hobbs regulation, don't you?" And no, I never heard of it. They directed me how to find it. I went out there. My wife and I violated the sign that says no trespassing. Drove out the nice, beautiful, gorgeous property and the barns and the house and uh, knocked on the door. Nobody answered the door. I told my wife to sit in the car. And if you hear shooting, just drive away, leave me for dead. Uh, but anyway, I heard voices back in the barn. I walked back that way, and as I'm walking towards the barn, I see two ladies, one about my age, old person, and a younger one walking towards me. The older lady is looking pretty stern, like, and I knew when I held up my hand, I said, "I'm sorry, I couldn't resist trespassing. I know I'm doing. My name is Dan Hobbs." The older lady got a big smile on her face and said, "Hello, Dan. I'm Betsy Hobbs." There was 6 generations removed cousin. And from there, she showed me around, and that upper right hand, I don't know if you probably can't see for the glare on the lower right hand, there's it says historic house Hobbs regulation above it. As I love that, that's the original fireplace. And that original fire, this is the parlor of that house. On the left hand side, you probably can't see it today, it's too small, but there's a notch in there where my ancestors used to sharpen their knives at the fireplace. So I have a kinship here, and I talked about to the gate of Annapolis. That was a tricky thing to find, by the way. There's a marker if you go out West Street. West Street really is the old Indian Trail that became eventually became Route 32. It runs up this direction towards Elkridge. But I found it, and one of my favorite things is I don't know if you could read it. It said the gate was put here to keep out cattle and run of ill flame. That gate was there to keep out cattle and men of ill fame. So that resonated with me. That resonated with me because that old Indian trail, 30 miles or long or so, ran almost directly to Hobbs regulation. And it's no wonder that the thugs from Elkridge, the Sons of Liberty are up there, had gathered there one evening to set the story straight that you're going to hear. Okay, let's go back to the ship for a minute. Anthony Stewart's Peggy Stewart with Captain Jack and a crew of 6 or so spent about a month or so before March gathering up hogsheads, the bearers that were about that tall, to load on that ship until she was as poor as she could possibly be with tobacco. That was the money making commodity at those times. In fact, my first ancestor was the sexton of Creek Airlines Parish, then Church of England. He was paid 500 pounds. His name was John Hobbs. He was paid 500 pounds of tobacco for his work as a sexton of that church in 1728. So tobacco was let go. So everybody was raising tobacco. We're starting to shift. Charles Taylor Carrollton was starting to shift towards meat because wheat was a commodity that could be sold here very well, but tobacco was still the commodity. And they would pack them into those hogsheads and then pack those onto the ship and then out the Chesapeake, out into the Atlantic, catch the Gulf Stream and ride it all the way over to England into London. That was the trip. That was the trip that the Peggy Stewart take. And remember, I told you that if he could get top dollar for the Peggy Stewart, he wanted Captain Jack to sell that brigantine and find a different way to come back to America. Or what happened? They got out there in the storm. The ship was damaged, not badly. The cargo is damaged, not badly. They were able to make it all the way into London in the Thames River. Then I guess the shipping was so thick. There was a comment that said you could almost walk from one ship to the other and cross the river without getting your feet wet. Pictures of Peggy Stewart there amongst hundreds, maybe thousands of other ships in the London harbor, and Captain Jack was tasked to sell a damaged ship with damaged cargo. It didn't work out so good. Didn't work out so good. Okay, so there's a backstory now that you'll have to be careful and listen to me. Anthony Stewart had two business partners called the Williams brothers here in Annapolis. Well, not here, but in Annapolis. One of their brothers was an agent, T.C. Williams, in London. Anthony Stewart's business partners had a nefarious reputation. Why he had them as a business partner, I don't know, but it came back to bite him in the worst kind of way. So T.C. Williams is over there, and there may have been some subterfuge about the selling the Peggy Stewart. I don't know. The all the evidence was that it just didn't sell. It was just not a commodity. There was too many of those kind of ships. So she loaded luxury goods like this. This is a China bowl. Have you seen this? This bowl is in the Heaven Harvard House Museum in downtown Annapolis. Beautiful, beautiful. Maybe one of the last surviving relics of the Peggy Stewart. And also, she loaded 50 some Irish indentured servants. 50 some in a brig. Remember, their lane space wasn't like your average cruise back across the Atlantic. They had just a little over 400 feet of head space. So put your hand on your hip there. That's about the roof of their rooms. And they had about 6 to 12 inches of personal space that they could use. And they were all packed in there, ready to go. Picking up in London and while they'll stop perhaps in Land's End in Somerset before they started back across the North Atlantic. All well and good. However, some of those Irish were not necessarily, they were more surprised that they were on the ship and where they were going because they got lied to. Some of them were kidnapped. Some of them were sold by their family because they couldn't feed them. And they're on the ship kind of against their will, if you will. And one of my ancestors, the first Hobbs ancestors, claimed exactly that. That one day he went down to the harbor with his father or got on the ship just to see to look around, and the ship left with him. So he claimed he was kidnapped from America or from England and brought to Ireland actually and brought against his will to America. So we don't know the disposition. Actually, now after I've written the novel, I now have the names of all 50 some of those Irish and what kind of skills they had, but I couldn't find that until I finally published it. Yeah. Anyway, so my names of my Irish on board are typical. They actually are allegorical. So if you ever read my novel and have a good laugh over Irish names and the significance of that and the allegorical aspect of that, those are not, those are fictional characters I created, but they're pretty much the prototypical type of skills, by the way. All right, so those Irish are on board. They now and then, from what I was told, and unlike a slave ship, they had freedom a little bit to move around. They were allowed by the crew on top deck for a little bit of time each day to get a breath and stuff, but it was not a pleasant environment. It normally would have been, because we're pushing against the wind going home, if you will, against it would have been maybe 3 weeks or a month at best on a grid trip coming back across. And now there's another little story. It's a factor here. As they were leaving the final wood, it turned out, actually, a final exploitation exam center at the mouth of the Thames. It turned out that someone had snuck 2,000 pounds of that noxious weed tea on board, wrapped as linen. So the inspector found that it was mismarked, almost had the crew arrested and returned back to port. But because Captain Jack was willing to change the manifest and list the tea as British tea, they allowed them to continue on their trip. Who put that tea on board? Well, the best evidence says that T.C. Williams, under the instruction of his brothers back in Annapolis, had instructed T.C. to load a non-importation item to discredit Anthony Stewart so they could get his business. Yeah, yeah, the plot thickens. All right, so immediately north Atlantic. Coincidentally, about 3 weeks before they're in the North Atlantic, a hurricane. Yeah, hurricanes like come into the East Coast. They usually come into Outer Banks, maybe here farther north, and they'll do damage to the continent of North America. And then they'll curve on out past Halifax, Nova Scotia, and then out into the North Atlantic where they'll gradually die. Well, guess what? Our hurricane, they didn't call them that then, came in right in Annapolis, tore the roof off a brand new state building, damaged a lot of the cargo buildings down in the center by the in the key, and curved on out and catches the Peggy Stewart in the North Atlantic. What else do we know about hurricanes? Which ways does the flow go? It goes counterclockwise, right? So as the Peggy Stewart gets into a hurricane, she has no and is getting damaged, badly beaten. She has no other choice than to run with the wind until she could get out of that. So she was with the wind, basically carrying her way off course down into the more of the southern part of the North Atlantic, where she ends up being about 2 months late. Picture you're doing that Irish indentured servant in the belly of that ship for now about 3 months, and the ship is sinking. It's all they can do by humping the bulge boat to keep the water out of it for keep it from going down. They finally prickle in to the harbor. And Anthony Stewart celebrates the fact that his ship made it. If that ship hadn't made it back, he might have really truly been deeply in debt if she'd have sunk out there somewhere. So he's right. Celebration. The Peggy Stewart's held until Captain Jack brings the manifest ashore, and there, on a manifest, is that 3,000 pounds of noxious weed tea. So what do you do? You got a choice. Get that shit back to London. That isn't going to work. His indentured service, the Irish, are gone in that ship it's sinking. They didn't care about the Irish because they didn't care about the money that they would provide him, so he wanted them all. To get any cargo off in those days, you had to pay the tax on all of the cargo. So Anthony Stewart, I'm sure with a heady heart and great deal of reluctance, to save his money, paid the tax on that tea. Explosion. Explosion is exactly what the Sons of Liberty were hoping for. They wanted to see someone, particularly someone and his father-in-law tagged as British loyalist, to do something that was against the Patriots were all meeting in Philadelphia on the First Continental Congress at the time. This is like the worst time that you could bring non-importation items into a harbor. Okay, so it starts to get really fun here. Last year, October 19th, exactly 250 years ago, I stood dressed like this as all my side relatives, Matthias Hammond, behind his house. That's the Hammond Hole and House Museum. I was very privileged to stand there and talk to our audience. Some bigotries and stuff. It was a great opportunity. But Matthias Hammond here is right there about the senior day in town. Charles Carrollton was off on a quick business trip. Pekka and Chase and Ray Baker, they were in Philadelphia. They come because of the founders. So the duty for fighting that rope to two with the 2,000 pounds of tea fell to Matthias Hammond. He got together at Lord Brick Theater on Outlaw Street, Zibalot that street. It's long gone. So he got them together, had all the witnesses. October, it's a warm day. Brought them all in. People, they were so crowded that the people were listening in the window to find out, and there was a lot of bantering back and forth. Burned the ship, hanged Anthony Stewart, and the Williams brothers. Anything but a solution. So finally, Matthias gave up. Okay, let's schedule another one. That was on the 16th. On the 18th, they scheduled another meeting, this time at a bigger, more public venue down at well, gosh, I forget the name of the tavern down right, it's still there, right on the quay. Sorry. I'm sorry. Rollins. They're not Rollins Tavern, that's too small. The one that's all the way down by the water, it's right down there by the harbor. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so they gathered there, and again, it's too much argument. Back and forth, there was nothing to settle. So finally he gives up because, okay, guess what? Charles Carroll or Carrollton, he's a great guy. Everybody respects him. Let's wait till he's back. So he waited till he's back on the 19th. And meanwhile, the thugs from Elkridge, Dr. Charles Warfield, and Captain Thomas Hobbs, and I told the guy they're hearing what's going on. He's already debating this. That tea's not coming on shore. So they gather at Hobbs Regulation and their horses, and they go on down that 30 miles, and they show up at the 19th. Actually, they showed up the evening before, and you see that picture of the gallows? Yes, indeed, right across there where the academy set. They put up a set of gallows. We're controversial over whether they were actually held or you or not, but the one thing they did is they burned Anthony Stewart in effigy for sure there. And they left the gallows there, and then they were at the town meeting the next morning, or all the arguments, burn the ship, hang Anthony, bring the tea ashore and burn it here, leave Anthony alone. All it went. And finally, Charles Carrington called for a vote. And what was the result of that vote? No, it was bring it to ashore and burn it on the quay. That was what the town decided. Huh? Wait, I thought, dear, you said that they burned your ship. Or can you imagine Anthony had to really humiliate himself to get to the point where they would bring the tea ashore on the key, theoretically, or maybe you would call that not really American soil because it was a stone uh, pier setting out there a little bit. So it was kind of man made at that time. But they actually confessed. They wrote out a long confession. You can look it up. Over a year, that long confession. He labored over that and confessed to bringing on her importation act. They called the Wades brothers, the two brothers here in Minneapolis, for there to confess. That wasn't good enough. They wanted to get down on their knees in front of the people, and they confessed. And then Charles Carroll called for the vote, and it was, okay, Anthony's okay, guy. Yeah, he's made a mistake. Wayne Brothers, well, what the heck. Let's bring it to you, share. Well, those thugs from Elkridge were in that crowd. They did not like that vote. So they right way to go back up to Anthony Stewart's house, just a short walk up the hill there, and they surrounded and waited for Anthony, probably coming back going, yes, I guess I just state that one, that there are all these people gathered around his house. And they gave him a choice. Anthony, here's your three choices. Pick one. You can hang here for war crimes against the American people, or work on your house. And oh, by the way, his wife is on the second floor, 11th hour labor, giving birth to their second child. Or would he go burn your own ship? Well, faced with those choices, these thugs from out of town, these ruffians who didn't have refinement, won the day. Anthony made a decision. Matthias Hammond, who, by the way, is his backyard neighbor, rode with him. Captain Jack, a few others, got on a railboat, put it under full sail, pulled the anchor, and set her on fire. And she coasted up the river with the tide and grounded right at where the Naval Academy is to this day. That's why Anthony Stewart burned his $10 million ship. Call that righteous? I don't know. I think it was a clique in American society. How would it stand these days? Would people react the same way? Did they have all the evidence to make a good decision? Was it really Anthony Stewart's fault? Yes, he owned the ship that brought the tea. Yes, he paid the taxes. I'll let you think about it for yourself. The story really is not about him. The story is about the Patriots and the American attitude in 1774, and where was that going to lead? It's going to lead to the birth of the greatest nation that's ever existed on the face of the earth. So I have a saying. There was another background in this story that is very powerful. There was a guy named Robert Strawbridge. He's known as the father of Methodism in America. I met with his family before I began the novel, and I talked to him. He was a circuit rider that rode right in here and all the way down. He was actually in Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, but in a 100 miles preaching the gospel. And I asked the family if it was okay to put words in Brother Strawbridge's mouth, and they said absolutely. Well, I told him, he says in Gaelic, the first time he speaks, he says, when others seek to cleave with hatred, cleave it to love. And he's meaning God's love. So I ask you this, if you were the Patriot, or if you were the Loyalist in Annapolis, what would you have done? What happened next? Well, the Irish Club ashore. My story in Anson Wood Garrett, if you like that kind of thing. The barrel I showed you down there in the Howard House Museum, if you'd like to see it, where the ship burned to the waterline, is now the United States Naval Academy. And I have a great respect as a retired military officer of his Air Force. I still respect you guys, though. As a great respect for those people that have gone through the sacrifices they make. I think it's appropriate that there was a ship one day that the Patriots demanded, because it was against American culture, that it be destroyed. I think it's kind of poetic, if you will. And there, I don't know if you can read it or not, but there it says, near this spot, that's mounted right down there by the river on a boating there. I don't know the names of the boating because I'm not an academy guy. Near the spot, which was then the shore of the bay, the brig Peggy Stewart was burned by her owner, Anthony Stewart, October 19th, 1774, to pacify the indignation of the citizens roused by the payment of duties on 17 boxes of tea. That was the story of the Annapolis Tea Party. Now, this is no elephant stomping. I'm not here to sell books. If the story interests you and you would like to read it, you can find it. I will tell you this: my publisher is Christian Faith Publishing. They do not allow over the top letters. They do not allow over the top scenes. It is a 500-page novel. It does have in it enslaved people, but they're treated very doubly. I had a consultant by the name of Rilla Banks. Maybe some of you know her. She's a writer for African American woman who does research and writing about African American culture. Here she corrected my thinking on how African Americans would have operated as enslaved during that period of time. So I think it's genuine. I had historians read my manuscript, some of them that worked in museums here that claimed that the history was accurate. I'm just infused, as I mentioned, so fictional characters. They, in my mind, to enhance the readability. If you're a purist historian, I actually met one last fall where he shook my hand and in turn walked away without even greeting me whatsoever. So he didn't like the fact that I infused fiction in there. If that bothers you, I would highly encourage you not to buy or read my book. And in the novel is something I say it was pastor endorsed. I actually had the pastor, my pastor, guided me through some of the way that Robert Strawbridge taught, the influence of faith had on the Irish passengers on that ship. So if you like that kind of thing, you'll see that. So you can leave my novel sitting on your bookshelf or on your coffee table, and not be. And you have a teenager or something, you could not be embarrassed by that. Anyway, that is my story. I will allow opportunities for questions, though I might be able to answer. However, as I said, I'm not a historian. I'm an Irish storyteller, so I got to just be careful what I my answer. I'll try to be as honest as I can. I'm honored to sign books or any other material that you like. Uh, the paperbacks are $20. The hardbound are $30, and you can buy it for like $10 on your Nook or your Apple device or your Kindle. Or if I sign those, I'll scratch the screen. So you probably don't want me to do that. Um, so that is one more thing. Clean America Patriot Flames was 2022. Clean America, the Continental Divide starts right here and goes over those mountains into western Pennsylvania. And you think people on the ship had a hard time. That was temporary. Those people that went into the wilds of western Pennsylvania and the little sliver of Virginia that's set out there, they really had thousands called the borderland in those days. You got over there and you were in a survival situation. You are in a survival situation pretty much alone. So that's the Continental Divide. Yes, my fourth ancestor down married the girl next door and went over those mountains into western Pennsylvania. And two things happened while he was there. He survived. The other thing is he walked right. Those Irish and Scots and Scot Irish people, they have a one of a rebellious streak, don't they? And they didn't have this great love for the English. That's where this new the Constitution is signed now. I mean, it's done. If you were it's ratified, I should say. They didn't want to what was happening over here with the consolidation and power into the hands of a few. Looked like another aristocracy was building there. So have you ever heard the term Westernia? I had never heard it until I started. But those Irish Scots and Scots Irish, yes, those are three different groups. They decided they were going to form a new country and break away. Dang, that Constitution, we'll do our own. And you may have heard that little scuffle called the Whiskey Insurrection or Whiskey Rebellion. That was a symptom of a cause. That was the symptom of a cause. And what happened there is remarkable because ultimately the Presbyterian ministers, they were Christian, trained PhDs, four of them, were those willing it's a great sacrifice of their lives and their families and their wealth to preach to the indigenous and try to build community among the whites that were moving over there in mass. And you know what they did? They set off the genesis of the Second Great Awakening, and that was published in 2024. That's going to lead to the final Clean America set during that little scuffle between the northern states and the southern states. And that work there, that abolitionist movement that was started by the Second Great Awakening, as a result of the Second Great Awakening, ends up in fracturing the greatest cleave, I think, in American society, which was the Civil War in the 1860s. And that's that'll be the end of the Clue series. And there's one last one for you that like this kind of stuff. Book that I've conceived. I've got a framework. I've got support. I have national parks and a few other for one. It's called Owens Lock. Ishka Baha Owens is a boatman on the C&O Canal in the mid 1800s. Ishka Baha, you said, well, what kind of name is that? Well, Ishka Baha's mom, when she conceived, the father ran off and he was a ne'er do well alcoholic. And she was so angry when he left and she had her first son, she named him Ishka Baha, which stands in Gaelic, it's translated living water. Okay, that's not so bad. Well, if you say Ishkabaha in Ireland or Scotland, they'll just hand you whiskey. That's right. Ishtabaha is a euphemism for whiskey. So she named her son Whiskey, also living water. And guess what he does for a living? He's a boatman on the Sino Canal. He makes his living on the water, living water or whiskey does. And that's a novel that Lord willing, will come about. And it's a romance novel set on the C&O Canal. Hopefully, we'll have that out in 2027 if all goes well and my team would support me. Anyway, I have bored you well enough. I will stop, and if you want to ask me some questions, I'll make up answers. Go ahead, sir.
Question, comment less than a year after the burning of Peggy Stewart, to this, the 250 years ago this year, that Marylanders decided to thread the banks and no loyalty to the crown. My question to you is, was Anthony Stewart able to profit by the Don P? That was the watershed. Simply the issue, sure.
What happened? Yeah, that's a good question. Anthony Stewart and the Williams brothers, even though they confessed and burned the ship, that weren't the end of it. They hounded that poor man, and he right away got his wife, their brand new baby, and their daughter Peggy out. We went to do her first. They knew her for still loyalist centric at the time, and then eventually they fled to Halifax. And then years later, 1790, he came back from Canada back to Annapolis, where apparently he died just overnight. Something happened to him, and they buried him apparently at All Hallows Church. He never recouped any of the money from the burning of his ship. It's a car. Oh, the car that. Yes, the family did, or the conglomeration of the Williams brothers, the Anthony Stewart, they got that money from there, but they lost a $2 million ship. So I don't think it compensated for it. Other questions?
Is there actual list of who the Elkridge thugs were? I know you mentioned Warfield but who else was involved?
No, not that I know, but if you look at a map at the time, you could pretty much look at the names of the farms that were there along Braddock's Road, and you could probably tag a vast majority of those people. Typical names, Matt Dorsey, I'm sure there was Dorsey, Snowden, Howells, Howards, I'm sure they were among those radicals. Young men in their, Charles, I mean, uh, yeah, Warfield, he was a doctor, but he was in his mid-20s. These were young men that were doing this. So it's kind of surprising to think, intellectually brilliant, of course, and driven, but they were young. We see pictures of George Washington and Adams and Jefferson and fairy tale Alexander Hamilton. as it's called in my second novel. That was a real name they gave him, Alexander Hamilton. And you always see them; they look old, but they were young, passionate men at the time. Yeah, yeah. So no, I'm sorry, I don't have a list of the real thugs.
So where is the boundary of Elkridge? Does it is today there is an Elkridge community, but now but it certainly doesn't extend all the way up to West Friendship.
Yeah, that one I don't know, but the closest port was Elkridge Landing. So to go from here to get your cargo, you would roll. There is in fact I was a guest at the house of a wonderful gentleman named Ivan Sutton, and he says, my house is where the rolling road is right there. I said, rolling road. He said, yeah, that's where they would take the hogshead barrels and roll them down to Elkridge Landing so they could be loaded on the ship.
So is that why Eric, you're just trying to make the connection of the thugs of Elkridge?
Yeah, why they gathered there was the closest identifiable community as far as I know at the time, which is Elkridge. Yeah, because there's the Buildite village there, I guess, at the time. Yes.
I know when Joshua Barney was wounded during the skirmishes during the 1812 war, they said he returned home to his house in Elkridge, and his house is in Sandwich. So I know at least that far down is still considered Elkridge.
Hey, Keith.
I wish I was from around here, but sir.
We run the Irish first, and we're glad they can now our third or fourth Polish girl. But geographically, the ridge that begins at Elkridge ends at Mount Eyre. And so that one ridge goes across through our high is the highest point, but all we have in our area, and that would be geographically Elkridge, even though it was different than the landing, but this geographical area is a ridge that runs through Howard County, east-west train.
East-west, though.
Yes.
They did a little south by south. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I create a fictional geographical and it's allegorical turn for that ridge called the clef, which runs very close to where Hobbs' regulation was. I call it the clef for obvious allegorical reasons, and I explained it in chapter 1 as a point where the land tapers on either side downhill, so that you would want to take your hogsheads someplace where likely it would be more dry than if you were trying to roll it in a low-lying, swampy land. Anyway, that was just something I made up. But so if you read about the clef, and you're actually reading all three novels, is an allegorical term for division. So just one of those things. Any other questions? Yo, golly, you've been wonderful. It's great to see these people. Please contribute to the Howard County Historical Society if you feel so led. And you have a wonderful, kind director who dresses funny, but otherwise, but thank you. I will stand up here if you're interested in my novels. So please stop by and say hi. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day. Where's the